On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Anil Beniwal. He is the head of engineering at Arcadia. We're going to be talking about a really interesting topic, probably relevant to a lot of startups, a lot of companies and growth, and it's about preparing to scale. Anil's going to talk to us about some of the prerequisites that you should have in place and also some of the consequences of what happens when you're not ready. Because obviously, when you're trying to scale your team and you're trying to set all those dominoes up, you have to have a lot of planning to make sure it all works really well. Anil, thanks for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, head of engineering, two things I always ask for is if you could give us a sense of what your responsibilities are and what does Arcadia do, and we'll jump right in.
Yeah, totally. So I'll start with Arcadia. Arcadia is a company that is trying to essentially help drive the adoption of renewable energy. Basically, our mission is to drive towards a 100% renewable future. A lot of people at the company are actually very passionate about the topic, including myself. And being here and being a part of the solution towards fighting climate change is obviously very exciting for all of us. We offer consumers a platform that they can sign up for to help match their energy usage with wind or solar energy. And we also offer a developer platform to enterprises that want to utilize our technology to build their own renewable energy offerings as well. I am the head of engineering at Arcadia. So I largely focus on basically anything around our engineering builds for our products. So that includes our consumer facing products, our backend systems, our infrastructure through our SRE teams, and anything along those lines.
Wear many hats, and with many hats, obviously, you're in a high growth company. You guys are doing some exciting things. So I know the topic here is talking about preparing to scale, and I think maybe we can kind of set some context of what scale means to you, so that we use that as a jumping off point.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, scale comes in many forms. And scaling can be customers or traffic. It can be going from a tiny team to a slightly larger team. It can be going from a massive team to a massive team plus 10%. For me, when I talk about scaling, I'm talking about the stage of company that's operating at let's say a mid-sized team, like the 40 to 50 range, trying to go to a big team, so 100 or more. Because that's where I find actually the most interesting change happens and probably where most of the challenges start to arise. And so that's relatively the scale that I'm talking about.
Awesome. So I guess when you're trying to put yourself in a position to be successful in helping the team scale, what are some of the, I guess, things you're looking for to know, all right, well, we have the groundwork to scale, right? So there's some basic things that you should be looking at and maybe outline what a couple of those are for us.
I mean, usually you're thinking about scaling because your business is doing well, and in fact, you feel limited by your ability to actually deliver for the business. And so, in order to meet all the potential that you have, you need additional resources for maybe more builds or more support or anything along those lines. And so, there are a few things once you get to that stage that you don't want to be caught off guard by. And so, when I joined Arcadia and when I've joined previous companies before, I've thought about these prerequisites because I wanted to lay the groundwork such that when that moment came where we quickly wanted to put our foot on the gas, we had all of these things in place. And it was quickly a matter of just hiring more people, as if it's that easy. But that's basically boiled down to that. And so a few things that I've thought about, even as I joined Arcadia, is things like team structure, making sure you have autonomous, kind of cross functional teams that can be focused on delivering value as independently as possible. So this means people who are comfortable kind of diving in across the code base where they need to in order to deliver on the mandate as a team. But it also includes kind of embedding cross-functional partners like product managers, product designers, maybe marketers, maybe analysts to help make sure that they have all the voices they need in order to be successful as a team. It also means from a technology standpoint, not focusing too much on front-end specialized people versus back-end specialized people. I actually try to focus more on full stack developers who can actually jump in on both sides. So you don't have any sort of bottlenecks that, for example, your front end team is completely stacked, but your back end team is wide open. You have lots of capacity there. And so thinking of a fully staffed team that can independently deliver on most of their features without having to wait on someone else is, I think, definitely a priority. Architectural opinions are something I also like to have relatively well defined, not necessarily set in stone because that type of thing will change over time. But you don't really want your team to operate in the Wild West. You don't want to be in a situation where anyone can do anything they want to solve a problem. Sometimes that's necessary at the earlier stage companies, at the companies that are smaller. But if everyone is choosing their own tech, their own patterns, their own principles, your code base is just bound to get inconsistent. And it's just going to be hard to onboard new folks and have them running quickly, especially if a feature requires spanning multiple domains at once. with disparate patterns, different tech choices, it's just bound to cause issues. And that's something you want to probably get ahead of. The other one I call like kind of the leaky bucket problem. So if you have, for example, a lot of tech debt that's causing a lot of on-call burden and it's distracting your team from just delivering value as their primary mandate, you won't really be able to have engineers focus on making sure they're hiring the right people, that they're onboarding those people effectively, that they're code reviewing with the right level of rigor and compassion, as is necessary, obviously, for new employees, but really all employees, that you can enforce patterns and best practices, and that at the end of the day, you can innovate and you can push your kind of industry forward. This one is challenging, especially because it's actually sometimes hard to convince stakeholders that you should be investing in this leaky bucket problem because it's not a clear straight line towards business impact, but there are ways to get around that. You can talk about the operational burden. You can talk about what I refer to as R&D potency for the team. So your ability to actually innovate and research and develop effectively. And in some cases, there's direct business impact actually, and you just have to show that to the business stakeholders. For example, if you have as part of your tech debt, it's actually resulting in data that you can't fully rely on or fully trust, then obviously then you can't rely on the strategic business analytics that you're doing. And that actually does affect the business. I've spoken to actually several orgs that felt overburdened by debt, and they thought the only solution was actually hiring faster, which is, I think, not the problem. And this is actually why I like to call it a leaky bucket. If a team is on fire with outages and emergencies, they're not going to pay attention to all the things that you want to be paying attention to. And so I think it's super important to actually solve this problem before you decide you want to put your foot on the gas in terms of hiring. Then obviously you need a fairly standard and consistent hiring process in place to make sure interviewers are trained to assess for qualifications that really matter. You do that through the standardized questions and evaluation criteria that actually reflects the needs of the role. Otherwise, you end up allowing for more bias and subjectivity that you don't really want in your hiring process, which could lead to actually poor hires and people who might turn out after 60 or 90 days, which is not great. The other thing I like to focus on actually at all times, at all stages of a company, but certainly before you try to scale, is diversity. I mean, we all know this is important, but we also all know that as an industry, we could be doing much more. And it's really easy to devalue this or deprioritize this as you're trying to scale your team quickly, because it's sometimes just easier to get the first candidate you see without realizing the knock-on effects of having a diverse team, right? Having a diverse team actually leads to many benefits, including actually greater revenue. There's lots of studies and proof points to that statement. And you can't necessarily deprioritize this because you'll end up having a bigger hole that you have to dig yourself out of, which is just not an effective way to be spending your time as an organization that's trying to scale quickly. And the last thing I'll say, which is hard to get right, every company struggles with this, but there's a semblance of product market fit that's, in my opinion, ever elusive that you probably want to have in place before you scale engineers very quickly. Or else you might end up in a situation where you've hired a whole bunch of engineers but don't know exactly how to utilize them because the product is shifting so quickly under their feet. So I would classify all of those in my mind as prerequisites before you decide you want to start hiring quickly.
Awesome. Those are some good pointers to keep an eye on. And I guess when you're trying to prepare to scale, obviously you mentioned having a good hiring process. On the flip side, when you're looking at actually having people start the onboarding process, how critical is that? Like if you're trying to assimilate multiple people onto the team, obviously the team might take a hit in a particular sprint, bringing those people on. Anything that you've seen work well in trying to make sure that onboarding component is less costly to the team?
There's a few ways that you can probably minimize the impacts there. One is you should be thoughtful actually about pacing and making sure that you're spreading out the hires on different teams, or you potentially can go faster on teams that might have more senior members because there might be more mentorship capacity on that specific team. But I think a lot of what I mentioned as prerequisites actually setting you up to onboard an engineer effectively. For example, having well-established patterns and frameworks and engineering principles is actually a really effective way to accelerate onboarding essentially, because people will join, they will know exactly what to expect when they jump into a code base. They will know the long-term vision of that architecture and can build towards it. And that will result in a lot less churn when people are putting a pull request and trying to make changes to the code base, and actually require also less involvement from my mentor because they can actually rely on some of the documentation that might exist or some of the packages or libraries or frameworks that might be already built into the code base. But that is certainly something you do want to take into account. You can't drive it all the way down to zero, but you certainly can help make onboarding much more efficient.
Let me ask you this question because I'm always curious. So obviously in a team where there's going to be high growth, having flexibility in staff is really helpful. You mentioned full stack people who can handle a little bit more than being, specialized resources in particular areas. So if you're kind of thinking about that, and then you're trying to think about, the scaling even further down the road potentially, do you see like there being an issue of having those people and now having to specialize into specific teams and being reallocated? Or is it a case where, listen, like we know we need, 20, 30 engineers. We want this approach of more, full stack people focusing on that next iteration is just too far out.
I will say similar to product market fit, a true full stack engineer also happens to be pretty elusive, in my opinion, in my experience, even. When you go to hire a full stack engineer, what you actually end up finding is that every engineer will naturally lean in one way or the other. Some people love UIs, they love React as a technology, they love animations, they love just the paradigm of how state management happens in that world. And some people hate it. And some people just want to be in the back end. They love interfacing with, making database queries much more efficient or what have you. And when we hire full stack engineers, we naturally find that everyone has a lean. But what we do is when we bring them on, we place them on teams, we try to balance that lean, but we also very clearly set the expectation that when the time comes and we have back end work to happen and the only person who's free is someone who might lean front end, that they have to be comfortable and capable of actually diving in on the back end when necessary. Over time, you might actually want to lean in and like embrace that specialization as your organization gets larger. You may want to hire front end architects, for example, or principal engineers who can come in and actually set a long-term vision for your front-end architecture, or help mentor engineers and get them more up to speed if they're not familiar with front-end technologies. Same goes for back-end. That's kind of a natural progression that I see. But the value you get about resource flexibility by going towards a full stack model, especially for the smaller sized organizations, I think is massive.
I guess when you're looking at your relationship with product and anticipating what they see as features, roadmap, you're talking and interfacing with sales, anticipating sales growth and demand. How much art versus science? I mean, I'm curious. I've asked the question before, different perspectives, but how much art versus science to this, ability to kind of start planning for the scale?
That's tough. That's tough. There's definitely some art here for sure. I found in my experience that oftentimes it's a business decision when you decide, okay, we're going to go for it. We've hit the traction. We've seen the green shoots. We want to accelerate in this direction and actually take a bet on what our traction has happened so far in the past quarter or two and see if we can actually have that stick and accelerate. So there's certainly an art there as well. And then also, as you know, and I think a lot of your listeners will know, roadmaps is hard, obviously, to get a roadmap right. Especially some organizations will think a full year out, some even think longer out. And your certainty for those later quarters ends up being very low. And so it's hard to predict for hiring for next year's roadmap because it's likely that next year's roadmap will definitely change before you get there. So there's a certain amount of art to how you think about that. The science part, I think, actually comes into making sure you're actually just expecting and embracing that change in the sense that, you know that things are going to change. You're going to have some flexibility, and coding and designing for that change, expecting to need to be nimble is actually a big part of how you should be thinking about writing software and building teams.
Interesting. I've read about Warren Buffett's investment philosophy, and I think someone asked him, "Do you know if stocks are going up or down?" And he says, "I don't know." And you see a guy who's really well skilled in making a lot of money in the market, and he's not living his life based on the decision of it's going up or down because his horizon's longer. In a cycle when you're a startup and you're in growth, that vision, that cycle is definitely a smaller window because obviously you have milestones as you're in growth mode. I think the tricky part, like sometimes when you're looking at the technical debt component that you mentioned, is those trade offs of speed, scale, come back, fix, but then there's always more and it gets buried. When you're looking at, let's say, a 2 to 4 year window and you're thinking about scaling your team, is there an acceptable amount of technical debt you're willing to take to help facilitate some of that growth versus having to go, hey, we have to come back to fix this?
I have over time gotten very comfortable with the fact that I will be wrong. I won't say how often I'm wrong, but it happens. And I think every engineer ends up being in that situation. Every business leader ends up being in that situation. We can design the perfect solution for how we understand our business today. And 2 years later, our business will have evolved. And any perfect decision we made 2 years ago now suddenly gets classified as technical debt. And I think that's totally acceptable and it's totally fine. It's just the nature of how businesses move, your competitive landscape moves, the industry moves. And so you're going to have code and technology that no longer matches. It's not necessarily fully in line with how you think about your business. To me, that's considered tech debt. To me, that's actually totally healthy. And you don't want to have it accrue because the longer it accrues, the stickier it gets inside your code base and the harder it is to extract. So you have to have a certain amount of throughput and paying that down over time. You have to have dedicated focus on it as well, or you might actually end up being buried underneath it.
It's kind of funny is I think the concept of tech debt, and I mean, you're in engineering, maybe you can break it down for me. I almost think that there should be two categories of it. Tech debt where poor decisions are made, and tech debt where the business shifted and you have to go back and address just some of the growth that you can anticipate. I mean, we can only look forward so much and whatnot. I mean, is it categorized in that way? Are you doing it? Should it be done?
I actually think there's a third category in there. So I agree with the first category, which is poor decisions were made. And that sometimes it's just like someone didn't think through something fully or didn't anticipate a future change or something. I actually don't know that that happens as frequently as people might think. I think more often what ends up happening is a corner is cut in order to meet a timeline because either it's a very important timeline to meet, it's a sales cycle or something, or a corner is cut because someone underestimates the impact of cutting that corner. And then people build on top of that cut corner, so to speak, and you end up with this problem that is a category of tech debt. I think that is actually more likely in terms of making a conscious choice not to do something or do the wrong thing. You think it's just temporary, you'll come back and fix it, and you never do. To me, that's got to be like a major chunk of the debt that exists in people's code bases. The other side about the business shifting, I think, is also definitely true, but also understandable and almost probably unavoidable and potentially unpredictable. It really depends on the stage of your company. The first one is the one that you intuitively think you should be avoiding, you should be identifying, you should make that decision, but in practice you kind of have to. And I think that's just like a fact of engineering, and it's going to end up happening to you.
I guess the flip side to this, when you're maybe ill prepared or maybe best laid plans don't go the way you think, and maybe you missed something before your team's about to scale. What are some of the, I guess, immediate consequences, right? Obviously, it's got to affect the current team, right? All of a sudden, you have much more demand for what you need to produce, and all of a sudden, your team's shorthanded. Maybe you just missed seeing the timeline. I don't know. It could be a dozen things. But when you're looking at some of the consequences of just missing the window of having things lined up, what are some of those things?
So there's multiple windows you can miss. You could miss the window of opportunity to scale before you absolutely need those resources. And then 100% you'll be under resourced at a time where you need the resources. And then you will be further under resourced because you have to interview and onboard people. And so that's certainly a challenge that can happen. I think the other challenge that can happen is not focusing enough, as I mentioned, on the prerequisites and deciding that it's actually the right time to scale, scaling, and then hitting problems because your code base now has disparate patterns. You don't have good structure in place to set expectations for each level of your growth ladder for engineers. So they don't know actually how they should be engaging with the rest of the team, how they should be leveling up other engineers. You may end up bringing engineers in at the wrong level, all of which, by the way, causes friction as you think about your team design. You end up actually zapping productivity. The whole reason you decide to scale is actually to get more done with your team. That's the whole reason the budget gets greenlit. That's the whole reason you actually run at that. And the answer to getting more throughput is both to various degrees, quality and quantity. Like we're not out here building empires. We're out here hiring people to get more done for the business. And if you just hire a whole bunch of people that actually aren't perfect fits for the role because you don't have a good interview process or a good way to evaluate them, or you hired the right people, but they don't know how to properly engage with your code base because the code isn't well structured and well thought through, you're not going to get the quality out of these engineers. You actually will just have a whole bunch more people, but not actually a kind of appropriate amount of additional throughput as a result. So those are kind of the consequences you want to watch out for. You really have to pay attention to those prerequisites or you end up in a situation with more people, but not a lot more happening.
Yeah. And I guess, curious what you think about this, but I mean, right now we're in a real tight hiring environment. I mean, I think in 2019 it was tight. I think right now it's potentially as tight as I've ever seen it. And when you're starting to plan, you're looking at the prerequisites and you're trying to anticipate hiring, 2, 4, 10 people, whatever it is. And then you start realizing that just the sheer time it's going to take for your team to spend to hire, to find the right resource, make offers and have to worry about them being accepted. How much of that impacts I guess, your preparation for this?
It's definitely something you consider. I mean, the market's really interesting right now. I wouldn't expect it to be the way that it's actually turning out to be for whatever reason. I assumed it would be a lot easier to find candidates, but it certainly is challenging to find the types of people you'd want to bring on. It's a business optimization. You can decide that now's not the right time to hire, but then you're also making the decision that you're not going to get all the things done that you want to get done. And that may or may not be acceptable for your business when you think about the long term roadmap or trajectory or revenue projections or whatever. And so it ultimately comes down to your business. Do you want to invest in hiring to scale up the team? Be realistic about how much that will cost you and other leaders in the org and just generally the engineers on the team, and how much you're looking to get done in the next 6, 12, 18 months.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely in your position, balancing all this, executing the team, health of the team, lots goes into it. I appreciate you coming on and kind of sharing. I know you guys are in a great growth mode, so I'm sure you're kind of going through this real time, and it's great to kind of share with everyone out there.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. If someone wants to reach out, LinkedIn is a good area to hit you up if they want to talk about something you mentioned on the podcast.
Yep, totally.
Awesome. I appreciate you being on. It's been great, and hopefully we'll have you back on. Maybe 6 months, year down, and kind of see how we can evaluate how growth and scaling has been happening at Arcadia, and check back in with you.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Awesome. That's it for this episode of the podcast. We'll be back again with a different guest, different topic, and I always ask for two things. One, if there's a topic you want me to cover, actually, Anil brought this one, preparing to scale, to the table, and I thought it was fantastic. But if you want to message me about something you want me to find a guest to speak about, always looking for that. And second, keep sharing the podcast. I love the fact that it's just kind of growing organically, and it's exciting to be a part of the journey. So thank you for listening. And we'll be back again. Thanks.